What if war wasn't invented by the cruelest humans, but by the smartest ones? For most of our history, there's barely any evidence we fought each other at all. Then something changed. And it wasn't a weapon. Let's call her Amara, a woman standing at the edge of a lake in what's now Kenya, 10,000 years ago. Her people fish here, gather here, and for as long as anyone can remember, they've avoided the group living past the reeds to the north. Today, that line is about to be crossed. And by tonight, some of them won't be alive to remember why it mattered. Scientists studying what happened at this lake are still arguing about what to call it, because it might be one of the very first true wars in human history. And to understand how people this peaceful ended up here, we have to go back even further than Amara, past the Nile, past the first farms, all the way to a fight that isn't even human. By the time Amara's people crossed that line, humans had already existed for hundreds of thousands of years. And for almost all of that time, nothing like this seems to have happened. So where did it come from? Rewind far enough, and you find something at the root of the primate family tree that already looks unsettlingly close to war. Was it always there, waiting to surface in us too? Or did humans have to build it from nothing? The answer is buried in bones, starting with a discovery that changes when this story really begins. In 1974, Jane Goodall was watching a chimpanzee community at Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania when it split into two rival factions. At first, it looked like an ordinary territorial split. Chimp groups had done that before. Then the raids started. Males from one side began slipping across the border in tight, silent, single file. Not to feed, not to display, but to hunt. One by one, over the next 4 years, they cornered every male from the rival group, held him down, and beat him until he stopped moving. Jane Goodall, director of the Gombe Stream Research Center, documented the entire 4-year campaign and later wrote about it in her 1990 book, Through a Window, describing coordinated ambushes that looked disturbingly close to a military patrol. By 1978, every single male on the losing side was dead. It shattered the idea that Jane Goodall herself had believed for years, that chimps, unlike humans, simply weren't capable of this kind of calculated, sustained violence. If our closest living relative can plan and carry out something that looks this much like war, is that switch already sitting somewhere in us too, just waiting to be flipped? So if that's sitting somewhere in chimpanzees, it should be sitting in bonobos too. Same rainforest, same size, nearly identical DNA. Bonobos are just as closely related to humans as chimpanzees are. And bonobos have a reputation as the peaceful ape, the one that settles tension with affection instead of violence. A 2024 study put that reputation to the test. The results weren't what anyone expected. Researcher Maud Mugino at Boston University, publishing in the journal Current Biology in 2024, tracked wild bonobo and chimpanzee communities for years and found something strange. Bonobo males actually got into physical fights more often than chimpanzee males did. More fights, not fewer. But here's the detail that matters most. In all that documented aggression, not one single bonobo has ever been observed killing another bonobo. Chimpanzees kill routinely, in the same raiding pattern Jane Goodall first witnessed at Gombe. So it isn't aggression that separates the two species. Bonobos have plenty of that. Something else entirely decides whether fighting stays fighting or turns into coordinated killing. And if two nearly identical species can land on opposite sides of that line, what decided which side humans landed on? Whatever decided which side of that line humans ended up on, you'd expect to find its fingerprints all over our history, if it really is something built into us from the start. Rewind far enough, and it gets strangely hard to find at all. Anthropologist Douglas Fry spent decades studying nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living picture we have of how most humans lived for the majority of our existence, and published his findings in Beyond War, Oxford University Press, 2007. His argument, across well over 1 million years of that lifestyle, there's strikingly little evidence of organized group versus group warfare. Most killings were personal, a fight over a partner, a grudge, a revenge killing settled one-on-one. Not armies, not campaigns. Not every anthropologist agrees with him. It's one of the more contested claims in the field. But even his critics admit something. The deep archaeological record is nowhere near as war-soaked as we might assume. So somewhere, at some point, something changed. which means there should be an actual first time. A moment in the dirt we can point to and say, here, this is where it started. The first actual crime scene in this story turns up on the banks of the Nile, in what's now northern Sudan. Archaeologist Fred Wendorf found it in 1965, a burial ground holding 61 people, one of the oldest formal cemeteries ever discovered. For decades, everyone assumed they knew what happened here. Then someone looked closer. In 2021, researcher Isabelle Crèvecoeur at CNRS and the University of Toulouse Jean Jaurès re-examined every single bone under a microscope, publishing her findings in the journal Scientific Reports. What she found overturned the original story. This wasn't one massacre, one bad day. Several of the skeletons carried both old healed wounds and fresh fatal ones, arrow lesions, blade cuts, meaning these people had been attacked before, survived, and were eventually killed in a later raid. The site is at least 13,000 years old, and it isn't a single event. It's a pattern. A pattern repeating on one river in one valley could still be local. A feud between two neighboring groups that spiraled out of control. Unless the same thing happened somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with no connection to this river at all. That's Amara's lake. Nataruk, Kenya. Not next door to Jebel Sahaba. Not even the same country. Nearly 2,000 kilometers away, across a completely different landscape, among people who almost certainly never knew the Nile existed. Archaeologist Marta Mirazón-Lar of the University of Cambridge, publishing in Nature in 2016, found 27 people there, several with their hands bound, arrow tips still lodged in their skulls. Two sites, two unconnected peoples, separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. The same answer staring back both times: organized violence. But here's the twist almost nobody expects. If war really does switch on once conditions are right, why did entire continents of humans never switch it on at all? Aboriginal Australians lived in isolated hunter-gatherer bands for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of people strong, and by Douglas Fry's research, large-scale organized warfare among them was an extreme anomaly, almost never seen. They had every biological capacity for it. They just didn't do it. So if it's not human nature flipping a switch, what is? Look closer at Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk and a pattern appears. Both sites sit on rich, fixed resources, a fertile lakeshore, a productive stretch of river. Not open, empty land anyone could simply walk away from. That pattern has a name, and someone spent 40 years mapping it out. R. Brian Ferguson, professor of anthropology at Rutgers University, Newark, has studied the origins of war for over 4 decades. In a 2018 study republished in Scientific American, he identifies the specific preconditions that make organized violence far more likely. A more sedentary existence, a growing population packed into one place, valuable resources worth defending, and, for the first time in human history, actual boundaries somebody could cross. Every one of those conditions was just beginning to fall into place in this exact period as people abandoned constant movement for farming, storage, and permanent land. Settling down solved the food problem, but it may have created a very different one, and once it started, it didn't stay in one place. Ferguson's conditions weren't unique to one river valley. Nearly 7,000 years ago, in what's now southern Germany, a farming village belonging to the linear pottery culture, one of Europe's earliest agricultural societies, came to a violent end. In 1983, archaeologists uncovered a pit outside the village holding 34 bodies. 16 of them were children. Kurt W. Alt, the anthropologist who led the skeletal analysis, found that most victims had been struck from behind with stone adzes, farming tools turned into weapons, in what looked less like a chaotic raid and more like a systematic execution. Bioarchaeologist Linda Fiebiger at the University of Edinburgh has studied several of these linear pottery mass graves and found a pattern. They tend to sit near the boundary between two neighboring farming groups, each with its own separate trade network. Different continent, different culture, thousands of kilometers from the Nile, from Kenya, and the same underlying shape. Fixed land, a boundary worth defending, a neighbor on the other side of it. Once those three things exist, it seems, this keeps happening. Almost like humans stumbled onto the same grim invention independently, over and over, anywhere the conditions lined up. Here's where the story gets a gut check. If war really comes from settling down and hoarding fixed resources, then modern-day nomadic foraging groups, people who never stopped moving, should look nothing like Talheim and nothing like Nataruk. In 2013, the same Douglas Fry from earlier decided to actually test that. Fry, now at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and Patrick Soderberg of Åbo Academy University in Finland, published a study in the journal Science analyzing every documented case of lethal violence across 21 mobile forager societies, 148 killings in total. The number that stood out, only 2 of those 148 deaths were fought over a resource like land or water. Almost all the rest were personal. Jealousy, a stolen item, a family feud, a woman fought over between 2 men. Not armies, not raids, individual grudges. Settled one death at a time. It echoed almost exactly what the deep archaeological records seem to be showing. But not every scientist agrees with that picture, and the disagreement itself is about to become part of the story. Not everyone in this field agrees with Fry, and one of his fiercest critics has a name. Lawrence H. Keeley, an archaeologist at the University of Illinois Chicago, spent his career arguing the opposite case. In his 1996 book, War Before Civilization, published by Oxford University Press, Keeley argued that decades of archaeology had quietly pacified the past, downplaying or explaining away evidence of prehistoric violence because it didn't fit a comforting story about peaceful ancestors. He pointed to sites like a mass grave in South Dakota, holding over 500 scalped and mutilated bodies, predating European contact, as proof that organized violence goes back much further and much wider than researchers like Fry allow for. This is genuinely unresolved. Some scientists believe war has deep roots reaching back further than any site we've covered tonight. Others believe it's closer to a specific invention, tied to specific conditions, no older than the evidence we've actually dug up. Which brings us back to Amara, standing at her lake. And the question we still haven't fully answered, did something change in humans themselves? Or did humans just finally build a world where war made sense? Here's the answer, and it's bigger than who threw the first spear. The strongest signal in all of this evidence doesn't point to war being switched on in our biology, the way it seems to be in chimpanzees. It points to something switched on by circumstance. Fixed resources, growing populations, food you can't just walk away from. Keeley's right that violence runs deep. But every early war site we've actually found sits on exactly that kind of resource. And every documented case of humans avoiding war for tens of thousands of years, like Aboriginal Australia, involved exactly the opposite. Mobility, nothing fixed worth dying to keep. Amara's people didn't fight because humans are secretly monsters underneath. They fought because, for the first time in the human story, there was finally something worth killing to hold on to. That's the twist in "the smartest humans invented it." They weren't smart enough to see it coming. War wasn't written into us at the beginning. We built the conditions for it piece by piece without ever meaning to, and then it built itself. Here's the detail that stuck with me most. The English word rival comes from the Latin rivalis, literally someone who shares your stream. 2 neighbors drinking from the same water. That's not a metaphor historians made up later. That's just what the word has always meant. Because for most of human history, sharing a resource with a stranger really was where the trouble started. We're still using that word every single day, for anything from a sports team to a coworker, without ever thinking about the lake it came from. So the next time something feels worth fighting to keep, that feeling has a much older history than you think. If you want to keep digging into where our worst habits actually came from, you know where to find me.